Today I have with me two experts on early college radio, Katherine Rye Jewell, who wrote the book Live from the Underground, A History of College Radio, and Christian Anderson, a professor of higher education at the University of South Carolina. His focus on the history of higher education, and he's the director of the Museum of Education. Welcome aboard. So, Katherine, we'll start with you. You've written this interesting book about college radio from the 1970s on. Tell us, kind of encapsulate that book real quick for us.
Sure. So those of us who came of age, let's say in the 1980s and the 1990s, have a particularly specific affiliation or association of college radio to the music industry that I think a lot of people will be familiar with bands like REM and Nirvana, and kind of the alternative rock scene of the 1990s that really had its roots in college radio. And REM, of course, is known as a college rock band. And so I started writing this book because I was a college DJ. I went to Vanderbilt University in the late 1990s. And in 2011, Vanderbilt closed our radio station. It got rid of the FM signal. It sold it. And so I started as a historian to try to think about, well, why is it that we have such fondness for these stations? Where did that even come from? And so I started just digging around and seeing what I could find about college radio history. And I found that there was no national history of college radio that had been written. And so I just started reading college newspapers, going to archives, trying to reconstruct what this looked like from a national perspective. And I found this really fascinating, multivariate history of all of these things that college radio has been since really the inception of radio. So Live from the Underground focuses on what college radio was, really starting in the late 1970s and its role in the music industry and in launching bands like REM to mainstream success.
I got to tell you, one thing that struck me about reading your book, I found it extremely entertaining and educational. But my college radio experience is nothing like what you write about in the book. It was, we were more focused on becoming broadcasters. And I think that was one of the things the FCC was trying to do. Christian, you were researching some of that early stuff that was going on, and in particular, the founding of WUSC and a Columbia broadcast icon was highly responsible for the creation of WUSC.
Yeah, so Mackie Quave, who people of a certain generation will know that name here in Columbia, he offered a class in the English department simply called radio. It was and so students signed up for that and got interested, and that was the birthplace of the idea to start a campus radio station at the University of South Carolina. And so when it launched in, we could go back and ask the question, when did it launch? But when it had its first attempt at launching in 1946, there was an article in the Gamecock, the student newspaper, in which Havilah Babcock, the famous professor of English here at USC, says, WUSC is the length and shadow of Mackie Quave. And then the article goes on to talk about how he sacrifices time, effort, and expertise to make WUSC a reality.
I got to know Mackie quite well in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He was doing the morning drive at WQXL here in Columbia, and I was during the all-night show at WCOS. I was top 40, and they were kind of country Paladin, or actually kind of more hillbilly back in those days, but I understand from him that he actually went to SCE&G and talked them into donating the copper that was needed to tie the radio station to the power lines for carrier current. Now, carrier current radio stations are not licensed by the FCC, which is a good thing for college people because they don't have their FCC third-class license to broadcast and operate the transmitters and everything. But it was kind of an interesting thing. So the first broadcast was actually done from Wardlaw College. Is that what you're saying?
So the club that launches this gets a license or a certificate from the intercollegiate broadcasting system in December 28th, 1945. And then in the spring of 1946, they prepare and they make their first broadcast in June 4th of 1946 from Drayton Hall, which is the auditorium in Wardlaw College, which is the education building, which at that time would have also been University High School. University High School and the College of Education were both in that building at that time. So it launched, but apparently that was short-lived. I don't know if it was only the one broadcast or a few, but then they really mark their launch as being the following year, May of 1947. They do test broadcasts throughout May of 1947 or the spring of 1947, and then launch in May of 1947. And that was from, at that point, they had moved over to what is referred to as the old slave quarters or former slave quarters behind what is now the president's house, but back then was a faculty house or had been a faculty house. And it's one of the only existing slave quarters on a university campus still in existence on any campus.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit of history there. And then sometime, I think in 1959, Russell House was built. And at that point, I think the station moved from that location to its what is actually its nearest second location now. It was the second floor back in those days, but they renumbered the floors, now the third floor.
I think in between there, they had a short stay in Rutledge College, which was USC's first building. I think they were upstairs there for a short while, and then they moved over to Russell House.
Yeah, when I joined it in 1963, they were in Russell House, and the transmitter was actually in the last apartment of married students' housing down the hill just a little bit. There's a parking garage there now, and where the pay station for the parking garage is where the actual transmitter was located back in those days. At least this is really interesting to me because it's kind of filling in some holes in my knowledge about the founding of the radio station, and I'm the oldest voice on the radio station. So
well, Rick, maybe you should tell people just a little bit about why you're I won't mention your age, but of a certain age on a college radio station.
Yeah, well, I'll mention my age. I'm 80 years old, so. But anyhow, I joined WUSC in 1963. I came to the university as a Naval ROTC scholarship student and was, of course, involved in the Naval ROTC and the college band. And there was a fellow on my dorm hall that was actually the president of WUSC at the time, and he said, "You got to come over and see the station." I've always been interested in radio, but I never thought I'd have a chance to do it. So I went over to the station and got hooked. I mean, that one visit was all it took to get me hooked. So I did my first broadcast on November 8th, 1963. I remember that date because it was a Friday, as a matter of fact. They were in the process of doing our first. Well, actually, the first radio broadcast that a newbie did was actually to tape a show that was played back later that day. So my show aired from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. Off a tape relay. Now, the funny thing about that is Russell House closed at 11, so we had to figure out some way to turn the transmitter off when the tape was over. So we rigged up this thing on this Ampex 350 tape machine to where when the tension arm fell, it turned the transmitter off. Now, of course, these were unlicensed transmitters back in the day. They weren't officially licensed by the FCC, which is why we could get away with such shenanigans. So that's I got my start there, and I worked with them as a student until 1966, and then joined WCOS-AM, a top 40 rocker, in 1965, and then in 66 is when I left school and became a full-time DJ there, which was a pretty good thing because later on I would come back to school as a double E major and finally got my degree in electrical engineering, which kind of backed up what I was doing in broadcasting at the time. So that's my history. So I understand you've been doing some research, Christian, on the on the people who signed the certificate of education for WUSC. There were 4 people. There was Sidney L. Wise, the president, William F. Newell, vice president, Virginia Razor as secretary, and Richard F. Newell as treasurer. Can you tell us anything about those folks?
Yeah, these were your classic, very active, very busy student leaders on campus. So we'll start with Sidney Wise. He was very busy in the Glee Club, fraternities, all kinds of student activities. He wrote for the Gamecock, the student newspaper, and then he was the founder of the radio station club, and was charged himself with raising the money to put it together. And he graduated, I think, just a year after it launched. So he wasn't really there to see it get going, but he was really the one who got it started. Unfortunately, Virginia Razor, I can't find her in the Daily Gamecock or the yearbook. So I don't know if she went by a nickname, a different, she got married and had a different name. I don't know, but I haven't been able to find anything out about her. Richard Newell, who went by Dick Newell, was also very busy on campus. He was in a musical. He was the president of a campus Bible club. He was in the Glee Club, I'm assuming probably with Sid Wise. And he also wrote for the Daily Gamecock. Same for Victor Barrett. He wrote for the Gamecock, was in the Clariosophic Society, was on the Carolina Review, the literary magazine, and eventually became the news editor of the Gamecock. So all of them seem to have had a deep interest in broadcasting, in journalism in one form or another. And of course, as Katherine can explain to us better, this was the cutting edge of the new technology of radio, or of broadcasting, or of journalism.
Katherine, in your research, is this similar to the founding of many of these early campus radio stations?
Yeah, it's very similar because of a number of different factors. So the fact that this is coming out of the English department is really typical of what's happening at these stations. A lot of them are coming out of rhetoric programs. They're very much focused on proper diction and elocution and presentation. And so there's a kind of natural curricular fit between radio broadcasting and what's happening in these rhetoric departments. And a lot of them are merging with English departments. A lot of them you'll see in the 20s and 30s, actually their own academic departments, and they eventually merge with English literature. Just to kind of back up for a minute, there was an earlier wave of educational radio in the 1920s. Now, of course, some of the first radio signals at all were sent at universities in electrical engineering laboratories or physics laboratories. Tulane had a lab in the 1890s, as they're just figuring out these spark gap transmitting to replace wired telegraphy. That is happening as an experiment by researchers at universities as early as the 1890s and into the 19-teens. Out of that, of course, would come AM broadcasting radio, broadcasting voice, and universities jump onto AM broadcasting in the 1920s. There's a proliferation of them. USC does not have an AM signal, as far as I can tell. Furman and Clemson both did. Clemson being, the engineering focused school, science technology, I believe. Is that right? It was sort of a natural fit there in that kind of experimental phase. And a lot of those get obliterated when the FCC comes around in the 1930s. And they're kind of treated as secondary radio operations, not as really professional, that they're run a lot of times by students or by academic departments. They're broadcasting things like lectures, which is, let's just say, not as entertaining as things like the Grand Ole Opry or Amos and Andy. And so they're just not able to keep up, and they get kind of pushed to the sides. So in that vacuum, college students are still really interested in joining the world of broadcasting and Hollywood and becoming professional broadcasters, whether it's in front of a microphone or whether it's behind the scenes as producers or engineers. And so students really want this as part of their college experience because they also see radio as this communications tool and they want to talk to each other. And so the technology becomes available in the mid-1930s for students to rig up these carrier current signals. The first of these is at Brown University in 1936. And they are actually just stringing wires literally from dorm room to dorm room. And that becomes the Brown Network, which becomes the intercollegiate broadcasting system. So that network of stations that USC joins in 1946, is launched in 1940, begins at Harvard, Columbia, a lot of the Ivy League, Williams College is in that first wave, Wesleyan, really focused in the Northeast. And what they're doing is they're paying for these stations on their own. A lot of them are paid for, they just have students subscribe. So they would pay a subscription fee like we do for Netflix now, and you get to wire into their system. Eventually, they decide that they want to sell advertising. And so they actually go to things like Beechnut Gum and say, hey, you can run your advertisements on our network of all these college stations, and you will gain access to this really lucrative market of college students. So IBS starts as really an advertising network. So there you have students who are able to gain experience in writing copy for ads and doing that kind of voice work and developing their portfolio, their professional portfolio. Now, you probably noticed this founded in 1940. Something happens between 1940 and 1945. That's kind of a big deal. And it sucks up all of the radio technology. There's just not equipment available because of the war. All wartime productions get switched over to producing things to aid the Allied war effort, and lots of college students go off to war. And so it really slows the growth of the IBS. And so it's no accident that you have probably a lot of former GIs coming back in 45 and 46, going to college. And a lot of them are coming back with radio experience from the Army and the Navy. And they're able to put that to good use. And so you see this huge expansion in IBS, which is, one of the more unfortunate acronyms, I have to say, because it does sort of, go over with a medical condition that is kind of unfortunate. And I always feel like I have to say that, like, yes, I recognize this. And so IBS really grows and proliferates into the 1950s, where because FM is only just getting started, it's very slow growing. This is a way that college students can get on the air and they can talk to the people that they care about reaching the most, which is other college students. It's contained to campus. It's not even really going outside of, the walls of campus at all, because you have to be within approximately 200 feet to pick up these signals from the steam pipes or the wires that are carrying the signal. So it's really not until the late 1960s that we see FM grow. And as Rick's experience demonstrates, USC will eventually make that transition into FM.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was an FM station at the same time that the carrier current AM station was running. It was run by the Department of, I want to say English, maybe. I'm not sure. But it was run by a very small staff, and I know there was some of my buddies who are still around who were actually broadcasting on the FM station. The AM station, of course, was carrier current, and it was more oriented toward community and pop music. The AM station, when I joined it, was playing a lot of music shows as well as the other kind of educational things you see. There was in 1963, Robert F. Kennedy was on staff on campus, and they carried his speech to the law school live, for example. That was one of the things they did. But they played music, and it was kind of like Armed Forces Radio Network before Adrian Cronauer. It was the they call it middle of the road music. That's what we played, and then. Sometime in 64, 65, a couple of us wanted to do top 40 radio on the station. And the management said, well, we're not going to let you do that right next to our regular broadcast day, which was 4:30 in the afternoon to 1 in the morning. So we founded the early morning show, and we called it the Dawn Patrol. I ran into Adrian Cronauer some years later and said, "Yeah, we stole your name." He said, "Yeah, you and half the free world." But he was a very interesting guy. Of course, Robin Williams played him on Good Morning Vietnam. So, and it was I want to say it was sometime in 1977 that we switched over to the FM and took over the old FM's frequency, which was, I want to say it was 90. I can't remember the frequency right this moment. But that was the first time it was broadcast. And actually, we do have a recording of that first broadcast on the FM station, which is kind of interesting if you've heard it. But
Katherine has heard it because she and I connected because I reviewed her book, and then we did a session at the History of Education Society, and in preparation for that, I connected with you, and you gave me that recording, and I actually played it at that session because it so perfectly illustrated so many aspects of her book. We listened to about 5 minutes of it, and I said, all these things that she talks about in her book are right there in that 5 minutes of the broadcast in terms of launching an FM station, the purpose of the station, reaching the student population and into the city, multiple aims of what the station would do in terms of serving the university, training students in broadcasting, also to have some fun, that it would play a broad spectrum of music of all genres except not top 40, that it would give campus and local and national news, and also they gave a little bit of history of the station in that clip. So it was such a perfect way to do that session, especially because one of the things that Katherine points out in the book is that she's tackled a very difficult topic here with the history of college radio because it's ephemeral. It's on the radio waves and then it's gone. And unless someone has the foresight to record that stuff, which luckily someone did for that launch, but we don't record, at least not back then, 24/7 what's going on the radio.
Some provenance on that tape. It came to me from Jane Daly Whitten, who is the daughter of the dean of students at the university. Not at that time, but yeah, it was at that time. He was still the dean. And she was a member of the station when it switched from AM to FM. And she had that recording that she gave me some time ago, and I digitized it. So that's how we happen to have it right now. So there's your provenance if you want to check the history on that one.
and bringing it full circle, her dad, Chuck Whitten, the dean of students we were talking about, was the founding professor of my program, the program I teach in now.
He was also my commanding officer in the Naval ROTC the year before he became dean. So there's a lot of mission and mashing going on there. So,
right.
Yeah. The station, it's my understanding from the history, from more oral history than anything written down. As a matter of fact, the Wikipedia page has got a ton of errors in it. So I don't know if you're doing your research how much you want to rely on that. But but the station first went on the air at 640 kilocycles. Now that number should ring a bell for you. That was the old Conelrad frequency, and it went to 730 the year that Conelrad was formed. So that's why they switched frequencies from 640 to 730, and it was at 730 when I was there. You mentioned, Katherine, you mentioned the commercialization of college radio back in those days, and indeed WSC had a couple of sponsors. My first show, the night, it was what was it called? It was called a late night show. It was some kind of late night show. It was actually sponsored by Coca-Cola, and we had two Ampeg 601 machines in our studio. We had no cart machines or transcriptions of the Coke commercials. They came to us on reel-to-reel tape, so we had to load those up on the playback machines while we were recording on the recording machine. So radio back in those days was a lot more physical than it is today. You queued up records, you queued up tapes, you did carts, you kept your logs and all that other kind of stuff. So it was a pretty busy time. So, Katherine, did the whole thing of college radio, you say, kind of bloomed in the 50s and into the 60s?
Yeah, so carrier current really takes off in the 50s because the FM equipment is still pretty expensive. And the thing that helps it take off is the FCC tries to give it a boost in a couple of different ways. One of the things that they do is they unveil the Class D 10-watt license. So this allows universities and colleges to buy a cheaper transmitter because it's not as big and powerful as a 10,000-watt transmitter or 1,000-watt transmitter. And this is the license that a lot of college stations go for because really they only want to reach about a 3 to 4 mile radius, just enough to kind of catch campus and anybody who might live in the surrounding area. So 10 watts really fulfills a lot of their needs. And so you see a huge growth of those starting really in the early 1960s. This, of course, is happening at the same time that baby boomers are starting to go to college, and you start to see huge enrollment expansions. Campuses are expanding. They're founding new schools of study. You get the rise of urban campuses. So places like NYU, for example, in New York City, it had a couple campuses scattered around, and it sees its enrollments just absolutely balloon in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And so now all of a sudden, instead of having two small campuses, one in Washington Heights and one, I forget where the other one is, but it's more uptown, now they've got this huge population that's spread out all over the city. And so they need something like FM to reach all of the students, or say Georgia State in Atlanta, which is a big urban campus. It is growing astronomically during the 1960s, and it has a lot of commuter students across the, I don't know what it is, 6 to 9 counties of metropolitan Atlanta. And so they need a huge FM signal to reach all of those students. And I think one of the interesting things that starts to happen, and I think your listeners will sort of start to hear this in the different examples that we've all drawn from, is that this thing of college radio or educational radio has a lot of different, even conflicting functions. Just that term educational radio, is that radio to educate the listener? Is it to educate the person at the microphone or running the boards? Is it to educate the public, or is it to educate people on campus, or is it just educational radio that exists at an institution of education? And the thing is that it means all of those things, depending on where you go, depending on whose show you're listening to. And that can also create a lot of tension in trying to figure out what these stations are for. And that's one of the reasons why you see, especially in a transforming world of higher education in the 1960s, a lot of churn, a lot of change over time in what college radio actually means.
Yeah. The one thing that is important to remember here is that when the 10-watt educational stations came along, they were non-commercial. The carrier current AM were commercial. So there was a difference in focus there, too, as a matter of fact. Of course, WUSC started off as the Class D station, the 10-watt FM station. When it moved to the current frequency of 90.5. We're now at 2,500 watts as a Class A station, so we cover 4 counties here in the Midlands with our signal. And it's amazing to me how many people who are not really associated with the university actually tune in because of the difference in programming. It's like nothing else on the radio dial, which is another hallmark of college radio.
Yeah, and that's really you start to see it in the 60s, this differentiation of programming. It's certainly there because it's serving people on campus. You get news about campus, you get campus events. It's radio by students for students with the community in mind, but it's sort of a kind of closely defined to campus. In the 1970s, you really start to see college radio develop this idea of it being alternative radio, where it takes that idea of we're not just doing not top 40, but we're really doing something completely different. And it's just alternative to whatever is on the commercial band. Now, there's some messiness there because a lot of these stations do get their start in that kind of commercial carrier current. But really what that was for was to carve out independence for those stations, that they were formed as student activities. And that, that by students, for students kind of ethos carries over into the FM stations, where the students had really made the case that they could do high quality radio that students wanted to listen to, that was also edifying, that represented the university well. And so administrations, by and large, sign on to students carrying that activity over into FM to provide a public service for the university, for the students. But they also get much more exposure to people outside of the university doing this thing of educational radio that sounds very different to what's happening on the commercial side of the dial. So it really starts to carve out this new way of doing radio that people come to expect from college radio.
You know, it's kind of funny. While you were talking about it, it seems like my current program on WUSC-FM is actually doing oldies. And the rules that I had was I could not play anything that was on the top 40 in the last 40 years. Well, the station's expanded the rule a little bit further, but have granted me an exemption. So I play 50s, 60s, and 70s oldies. But I do it the way radio used to be done back in those days, with jingles and high energy and walking up the record and hitting the post and all that kind of stuff that you just don't hear on the radio anymore. So I'm sort of alternative radio, but old alternative radio. So
well, to Catherine's point about the role of the radio station as an arm of the university's outreach mission. You know, right from the very beginning in 1946, while it was still trying to get launched, the radio club was invited to broadcast what they called University Hour on WIS radio station. And so that was sort of where they got to kind of try these things out. And they would do things like student programming and a faculty forum with students. And the program director for WIS radio was also an adjunct professor of English. Back of the English department and radio, teaching radio, but also a practitioner, in the business. And he said any university is obligated to share its talent and knowledge with the people that support it. And what easier way to do this in the 1940s would be over radio. This technology that more and more households and eventually even cars are getting.
Yes, that is so true. Well, I think we've reached a good point for us to kind of bring to a close this discussion. I think I want to do sometime to get together with you two again, and we'll carry out some further discussion. So I'll throw it to Christian first and see if you have any closing thoughts for this session.
I think you can just cut that piece that I just gave you and put it as my closing thoughts.
Okay, that worked. Katherine.
Well, I just want to show or use this conversation to show that college radio is still very much vibrant and alive and changing. And it's exciting to see stations that continue to innovate with what college radio can be in this new media environment. It's always been changing and it's always been evolving and adapting. And so it's great to see it continue to do that.
To that effect, we just had 4 or 5 people up at the conference in New York this past week. They got back to Columbia just before the snowstorm, so we're glad to have them back. So thank you very much, Christian Anderson and Katherine Jewell, for participating in this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Rick.